Welcome to Let's Just Talk. I'm your host, Hami. Joining us today is Congresswoman Delia Ramirez. She represents Illinois' 3rd Congressional District as the first Latina elected to Congress in Illinois and the entire Midwest. She currently serves on the Committee for Veterans Affairs and is the vice-ranking member of the Committee on Homeland Security. Representative Ramirez, welcome to Let's Just Talk.
Glad to be on. Thank you, Hami.
Of course. Representative Ramirez, as you know, at least 16,000 Palestinians have been killed, 2/3 of whom are reported to be women and children, with more than 7,000 Palestinian children killed in the past 7 weeks alone, and approximately 1.8 million people internally displaced. Somehow, our political climate in the United States has made it controversial and even career-ending for some to speak on the plight of the more than 7,000 Palestinian children who have been killed in Israel's response to the Hamas attacks on October 7th, which killed an estimated 1,200 Israelis and saw around 240 hostages being taken by Hamas, some of whom have been released since the truce. In the midst of all of this, you have been one of the few members of Congress, I think 34 out of 435 to be exact, who support a ceasefire. Can you elaborate for Americans why it has been important for you and your colleagues to continuously advocate for a ceasefire?
I often tell people, when I look at any legislation or any situation, I ask myself, how is this living into my values? How is this legislation going to take us any closer to unity? How is this going to further divide us? And as I look at what's happening in Gaza, it's gut-wrenching. The idea that bombing women and children in a place where they are stuck, right? It doesn't matter if they go north, if they stay north, if they go south, they have nowhere to go. And the idea that bombing that region with 2 million people, of which half of them is children, is acceptable to anyone is mind-boggling, honestly infuriating for me. If I think about what do we all want, and if truly what we all want is long-lasting peace in that region, we're not going to get there by bombing ourselves through it. Killing an entire community, an entire region isn't going to get us there. I know that diplomacy is the only way that we actually de-escalate situations and get to a place of a ceasefire. And quite frankly, what you saw in that temporary ceasefire was an opportunity to negotiate to release hostages. And also an opportunity, which I think oftentimes has been talked about, for a number of Palestinians who were detained as prisoners, some of them as children, being able to be returned to their families. And so for me, a ceasefire isn't, this controversial decision to be taken. It's the minimum we should be calling for. If long-lasting peace in the region, saving lives, prioritizing children is a priority for us.
Thank you for that. And what are the arguments that you're hearing on the side of your colleagues who don't support a ceasefire that think that is a strategic failure to call for a ceasefire?
Look, it's now what, December 5th? In 2 days, we will have completed 2 months since October 7th. Israel hasn't demonstrated that they are anywhere closer to what their mission is and what they say is ending Hamas or getting peace or safety for Israelis or Palestinians. The reality is that a number of my colleagues have perhaps said, a ceasefire isn't going to work. But what is happening right now in that region is not working. It's actually killing thousands of people, entire families. So for me, as I hear people say, well, ceasefire is not going to get us long-lasting peace, I'd argue the bombing, the killing of innocent lives is not going to get us to long-lasting peace in the region. I think concerns that I often hear from my colleagues is, well, you can't negotiate with a terrorist. But that short-term ceasefire that was negotiated, right? Third country, right? A partner in the international community who helped negotiate that saved lives, kept children from dying, for that short period of time. So that tells me that our early call for a ceasefire is the only solution for us to be able to stop the killings and actually begin a process that makes it possible for both Israelis and Palestinians to be able to be safe and free. This moment, we're doing the exact opposite.
According to a poll by the think tank Data for Progress, 66% of the American public support a call for a ceasefire, including 80% of Democrats, 56% of Republicans, and 57% of independents, who all back a call for a ceasefire. And these polls also reflect the sentiment of the United Nations, domestic and international organizations like Jewish Voices for Peace, amongst others. If these numbers are in fact reflective of the views of the American public, why is there such a disconnect between what the American public wants and what we are seeing out of Congress?
Yeah, we'd call that dissonance, right? Where we say one thing, or we say we're listening to our constituents or the people, but we're moving and voting in another way. Look, even the fact, I think it's about 44 members of Congress in one way or another between October 7th and today have called for some form of ceasefire. That is far more than we thought we'd have when we introduced the resolution for a ceasefire, and that is progress. That's actually progress because of those polls, because of the dozens, in some cases, I think we probably have seen about 100 protests, if not more, across the world, calling for a ceasefire. But the reality is that I've never seen an issue where there's more bipartisanship in this Congress than the one that we are living now, which is not listening to the American people. I mean, you heard 80% of Democrats are calling for a ceasefire, a little bit at about 50% Republicans are calling for a ceasefire, and even higher among independents. It is really mind-boggling to me that the constituents, the people we represent, are saying, you need a ceasefire. You must de-escalate. We elected you to lead with diplomacy. Instead, here we are calling for more money to be able to help fund bombs that are going to kill children. It is not who we say we are as Americans. It is not who we say we are as members of Congress, but there's a true dissonance between what people are calling for and those of us that have actually heard the call and have been leading the ceasefire call now since October. It's frustrating, and I think you've seen people talk about the influence of the different other organizations, powers of be across the country. Many of them who are influencing political campaigns, many of them who have strong lobby here in Congress, who in many cases have said to members of Congress, there is in no way, under no circumstance, you can call for a ceasefire because we have to continue to condemn Hamas. And there's a real frustration, because many of us have condemned Hamas. How many times must you condemn Hamas? And how do you use that as a tool not to actually address the war crimes that are being committed on the people in Gaza and the West Bank? But it is a tool that is used often here to keep members of Congress from calling for a ceasefire, leading with diplomacy, and it's quite frustrating.
Since the beginning of Israel's military offensive as a result of October 7th, defense companies and weapons manufacturers have seen huge profits. For example, according to Yahoo Finance, within the first 5 days of the war, Northrop Grumman saw its stock prices rise about over 8%, and Lockheed Martin saw its stock prices rise about over 9%. And according to The Lever, and I quote, two of America's largest defense contractors told investors that Israel's brutal war on Gaza will be good for business, with one executive predicting that its recent fourfold increase in artillery production will not be enough to meet the additional demand. Now, it's not surprising to anyone that weapons manufacturers make profit during wars or during times of turmoil. However, some are more intrigued by who the investors are. And according to the Center for Responsive Politics, at least 51 members of Congress, your colleagues, um, and their spouses have millions of dollars invested in the top 30 defense contractor companies across the globe. The question then remains, should the people who make decisions about whether we go to war or not, whether we send billions of dollars to support wars around the globe or not, whether we send young American men and servicemen and women to war or not, be benefiting from those decisions? In other words, should elected officials be allowed to invest in war stocks? And is that a conflict of interest, right? Because for those of us who are not Israeli or Jewish or Palestinian, right, the only thing that we can do is speak to the people that we've elected. So what is your take on that?
I think it's an absolute conflict of interest that members of Congress are able to vote on legislation that directly benefits and makes them rich or makes them wealthier. I think that is, and I'll be quite frank with you and pretty direct. I think that members of Congress should not be able to invest in these stocks, invest in stocks, period. I mean, I've been pretty clear, and when I campaigned, I said it, and I'll say it to you even more directly now. I mean, if you are investing stocks in defense that are leading to the deaths of thousands of children, it's not just moral. I quite frankly, I think it's unacceptable. And it is alarming to me to have read some of the reports and the number of colleagues of mine on both sides of the aisle who are profiting from this war.
And since October 7th, there has been worrisome and disheartening reports of the rise of anti-Semitism all across the country. And as someone with Jewish friends and professors, mentors, some of these reports have been hard to read. And to address this, and rightfully so, this morning Congress held a hearing with the presidents of Harvard University, MIT, UPenn, to hold campus leaders accountable and confront anti-Semitism amid a slew of anti-Semitic incidents across U.S. universities. And our Jewish brothers and sisters on every crevice of this country deserve to feel safe, to be safe and comfortable anywhere they are, here and abroad. And, I commend Congress for taking the necessary steps to ensure that this is so. And in that same breath, I must ask you, what, if any, is being done to address the rise of Islamophobia and Palestinian Arab hatred? And this particular question is also close to home as the issue of the rise of anti-Semitism, because I just graduated from Brown University in May. And as you know, a Brown University student by the name of Hisham Awartini was shot in Vermont with two of his friends for simply wearing a keffiyeh and speaking Arabic. And this comes after a 6-year-old Palestinian American boy named Khadija al-Fawumi was stabbed 26 times by his landlord just 30 minutes outside of your district in Illinois. What do you attribute these incidents to? And is there anything being done to address them?
Let me just start by saying to you that it is heartbreaking to see the rise in anti-Semitism all across the country and some parts of the world as well, in addition to the rise in Islamophobia. I think it is important that Congress address this and that it does everything possible to ensure that Jewish, Muslim, Christian, and immigrant, and the list goes on, communities are safe in this country. And the reality is that they're not. I think it was important that Congress had a hearing about the growing, rising anti-Semitism in some of these campuses.
Mm-hmm.
I unfortunately feel like it was one-sided, because there should have also been conversations about how to protect freedom of speech, of course, at all, I think, from every angle, but also protect Muslim students who are also being targets of rise of Islamophobia. You just talked about the student student who's originally from Vermont, and this little boy, 6-year-old boy, that his landlord would be so radicalized by what he was watching, seeing, maybe even hearing from members of Congress, that he would go into this boy's house, apartment, slam that door, and attempt to kill his mother and stab him 26 times. There has not been one resolution in Congress this year, but specifically since October 7th, that has spoke to in any way the rise of Islamophobia. Every single week, we vote on a resolution talking about anti-Semitism, denouncing anti-Semitism, but it is very discouraging to see that for many Palestinians, for the Muslim community, they have not seen one resolution voted on, partisan or bipartisan, that speaks to the fears, the lack of safety that the Muslim community is going through. And I'd say to you that I am personally working on legislation that really speaks to the core of that, to be able to honor the life of Wadia, but also to begin addressing the rise in hate crimes that you're seeing all over. You're seeing it at work. You're seeing that if a young person happens to go, or anyone goes to a protest and says free Palestine, it is automatically assumed to be anti-Semitic, and then grounds for dismissal. I find that really concerning, and I get passionate about this because I see this happening over and over and over. As someone who believes that the safety and the liberation of one community is interconnected with the other, I truly believe that if Palestinians, if Muslims are not free and safe, Jewish Israelis are not either. They're interconnected, and we should be working daily to ensure that we're going and working towards the liberation of both communities. It does not feel like that here in Congress.
Oh, that's disheartening to hear. This morning, Senator Bernie Sanders spoke in front of the Senate about the $106 billion emergency foreign aid supplement bill that will soon be voted on, and its lack of provisions for domestic issues, particularly the housing insecurity faced by millions of Americans. And you are sponsoring the Tenants' Right to Organize Act, which aligns with addressing some of these domestic needs. And I wanted to ask you specifically, how does this bill aim to provide relief and support for the millions of Americans dissatisfied with congressional priorities, who feel that their government can readily fund international wars, but fall short in addressing urgent domestic crises like housing?
Yeah, I mean, look, I want to talk to you about the bill, and I will in a minute. But I have to also say to you that I get these calls all the time, and I hear from constituents who say to me, Congresswoman, Congress spends more time censuring, expelling, threatening to censure, and fighting each other than actually passing legislation that's going to make my life any better. Shame on all of you. I've also heard members of my community tell me, y'all ask why we can't trust you, why we think that there's no real point in actually exercising democracy by voting. You are running a clown show. That means leadership. In this case, the leadership, and very clear, is the Republican majority. But it is really disheartening for constituents to feel like we spend so much time in particular issues, and in this case, certainly, you're seeing some of the challenges and needs of some of our allies or partners around the world. But so many people are at risk of losing their apartment or their home right before the holidays. In so many cases, there are people who right now are having to talk to their landlord, and their landlord said, if you want me to renew the lease, you're going to have to pay 25, 30, 40% more next year, or you're going to have to leave by the end of the year. I mean, starting the new year in the streets. is disheartening and unacceptable in a country where there are enough resources. But we have to actually prioritize the funding of it, which is why it leads me to the bill that I introduced a couple months ago, and it's the Tenants' Right to Organize Act. This bill will give opportunity for tenants who are living in housing voucher programs, right, buildings, to be able to organize among themselves, to be able to have better conditions in their buildings, to ensure that the property management company, the developer, the landlord isn't taking advantage of them because they happen to have a housing voucher. You'll find that in many cases we've seen in districts across the country, properties that are falling apart, and the landlord will say, well, it's a housing voucher unit. They should be happy with what they have. This bill will give the opportunity for tenants to be able to come together, form a union, collectively work together to ensure that they have adequate housing stock, as well as ensuring that increase in rents, even in housing vouchers or other things that come up, are not done unfairly. The second piece of that that's incredibly important is expanding protections for mixed status families. Right now, if your parents are undocumented, and you're under the age of 18, in some cases, you're not, actually in most cases, you're not eligible for subsidized housing. In many cases, they're living in a property like in West Chicago, in my district, where the landlord will double the rent and tell them, if you don't like it, you can get out of here, or I can call ICE. I mean, they are living in fear in absolutely horrid conditions, paying so much in rent with absolutely no protections. This will expand protections for mixed status families in a time where you are seeing anti-immigrant rhetoric, right? Islamophobic rhetoric. You're seeing anti-Semitic rhetoric fill our communities and see some of that impact within the housing industry. So it's an important bill, and I really hope that we can continue to build sponsorships for the bill, because it's going to really make a difference in organizing and preserving stable housing in this country.
Thank you for clarifying that for us. And speaking of anti-immigration rhetoric, immigration is one of the big issues at the forefront of the minds of many Americans, and is going to be a big thing in the next elections. On November 29th, you released a passionate opposition to this bill called HR 5283, a legislation that would prohibit communities from using federal lands to provide emergency refuge for asylum seekers. And you cited that this is a scapegoating tactic by the Republicans. And given your advocacy for the American Dream and Promise Act and your efforts to secure federal resources for asylum seekers in interior cities, how do you propose to navigate and counter these challenges that you're facing?
Yeah, I mean, look, Republicans are literally using immigrant families, people seeking asylum, children, as a bargaining chip in exchange for sending aid to Ukraine. They are saying, here we are, let's do some bartering here. We'll give you some Ukrainian lives money. In exchange, we're going to ask you to harm immigrant lives. That's what's happening here. And what's even more concerning is that if Democrats, if we don't stick together in this moment, we might find ourselves in a position in being asked to choose between Ukraine aid, or in some cases for some, in aid to Taiwan, or in humanitarian aid to Gaza or Israel aid, and have to make a decision. Are you willing to vote to make it almost impossible to seek asylum in this country, to perhaps reinstate family detention in some cases, which HR 2 has in its language, to do all sorts of things that would bring us back even more decades, instead of using this moment to identify opportunities to actually address the issues of the border, what is the reason for migration? Why do we have a broken immigration system? Why is it that people are still risking their lives in the Rio Grande and nearly dying? Why is it that we are allowing for immigrant families to be vulnerable in the Mexico border, in the Guatemala border, or even in our border? And why are we not changing the narrative? I mean, I think about this. We are allowing Republicans to set the tone around immigration and use border as their political chip that in their mind will guarantee them the White House, to maintain the House and regain the Senate. And we, instead of reshaping the conversation to what it accurately could be, is saying, what would it look like if we did the work in Latin America and these other countries to address the issues that are making people migrate from to begin with? The lack of democracy or democratic backsliding that you're seeing in places like Guatemala, creating these regional centers where people are able to get resources they need before they're coming here and seeking asylum. And then for the people that are here, not just the new arrivals, but people like my uncle who have been here for 30 years, giving them an opportunity to help us improve our economy by providing work permits, expanded work permits. We could be doing that. 9 million jobs, Hemi. That is the job openings at any given time in this country. And the immigrant community is ready with a work permit to take those jobs, to generate more taxes for our federal government, for our state and our city, to address supply chain issues, because now these companies have enough workers, so they have enough supply to help lower inflation, and the list goes on. But it's going to require us to call it what it is. Scapegoating the vulnerable communities in this country in exchange for money for Ukraine or other communities. And that is just wrong. You should not be putting two communities against each other in this way. We should be denouncing it, and we should be addressing the issue at core.
Thank you for that. As you mentioned, it is an election year is coming up. Immigration is going to be an issue. Whether Democrats are successful or not is going to reflect how people vote. So as we come to the end, I wanted to get your take on the upcoming 2024 elections and what you think the prospects for a Democratic win might be, because the last couple of months, many young people that I know have been disappointed with the Democratic Party, especially the way the Biden administration has handled current crisis, and its failure to deliver on key promises. And I'm afraid that the politics of saying, hey, but look at the Republicans, they're worse than we are, right, may not be enough to motivate enough young people and communities who have voted for him in 2020 to come out again and do so in 2024. So what is your assessment of what's to come? And has there been a strategic failure on the part of the Democrats in this cycle not to take advantage of some of these communication strategies and the things that they should be prioritizing and talking about, like you were talking about, and allowing the other side to shape the narrative? Because right now, the White House is Democrat, so we are expecting them to deliver.
Yeah, I mean, I've said this over and over. We have to give people something to vote for, not just expect people to vote against something, to go out to the polls and vote against. Apathy will continue to win, and in these cases, even the ideas of having any kind of leadership that looks like what we've had in the past with Donald Trump, or the chaos that we see in the House currently. We have to use every single tool at our fingertips to show that even if we don't have the majority in the House, the itty bitty majority we have in the Senate, and having the White House, having the administration, gives us the opportunity to use executive action and play defense when necessary and fighting back, but actually using those spaces of power to legislate in absence of legislative action through Congress. We have to be able to show, and I believe we can do that, that we have resolved to be courageous and do everything in our power with every tool we have to be able to help and aid our people, our communities. And that means that we create executive actions around housing stability, that we provide expanded work permits through executive action, that we protect our dreamers, that we get to the root causes of violence that are harming our communities through administrative action. There's 1,000 ways that we can be doing things that the people, the American people, the people who make our economy work can feel like we are fighting for them. And I know Democrats are fighting for our communities, but I really believe that folks, everyday people, are not seeing that fight equate into actual relief. And if that's not happening, people are going to say, I'm in the same place I was before, so why am I going to vote? I also think it is important that we take critique. Look, I am the first Latina from the Midwest in Congress, and I am incredibly honored. But the reality is that it's 2023, and how am I the first? How are we across the country around race and gender and religion and so many other cases still waiting for or celebrating first? It means that we are still so far behind in so many ways. But secondly, I am one of a small number of members of Congress who understand what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck, who understand what it's like to have a mother who works Monday through Thursday, minimum wage, taking care of a senior, and every Saturday cleaning homes so she can help her husband be able to keep their home in their 60s and 70s after living in this country for 40 years. It is important for people to see themselves in the people that represent them. This is exactly why we need more of us in Congress pushing the fold and actually speaking on behalf of the American people.
And last question that I have for you is, you talked about it's important to give people something to vote for. You're running for election again. What are you giving us? What are you giving your constituents to vote for? And then I'm going to ask this again. Has there been a strategic failure on the part of the Democrats? Because, like I'm saying, young people, a lot of us will either not vote or we just won't be voting Democrats because of how a lot of things have been handled, especially the current crises, because we don't feel represented either on the right or on the left anymore.
So look, I came in here and I was told, well, look, just do the best you can. You're in the minority, but when you're in the majority, you'll get things done. I refuse to live under that premise that I have to wait until we're in the majority. I find that to be BS excuses to not actually fight like hell for our communities, which is why I'm introducing legislation around housing. I'm co-leading legislation that would give dreamers a pathway to citizenship. But while I'm doing that, I'm calling on the administration on a regular basis to use their executive powers to do the work in absence of legislation. As I am here, I have met with organizations across my district. Every single time that I go back to district, I don't take vacation. I took 2.5 days during Labor Day weekend this whole year, because when I go back, I actually want to hear from people. I want to go talk to constituents. I want to talk to organizations so that I can understand what do they need and what resources through the appropriation process I can bring back. It's why I've secured, and hopefully once we've passed the federal budget, we'll be able to have $13.5 million in appropriations coming back to my district on issues like housing, infrastructure, clean energy, the list goes on. This is exactly the kind of work we should be doing and letting people know that we're working on. That when you call me and you tell me that you stand on A, B, and C, that I can have the courage to take your feedback. And in the case, if I'm agreeing with you, let you know what I'm doing in terms of ceasefire. My district overwhelmingly supports a ceasefire. And I've gotten thousands of emails either asking me to sign on, not knowing that I co-led, or thanking me for signing on. That people could actually feel like, yeah, she is one of us, and she's not using BS excuse to not be clear that things are not right. If I walk around and just talk about how we passed all this legislation last year, your life is great, but people are still struggling, clearly there's a disconnect there. So I think it's really important as Democrats, we're preparing ourselves for these re-elections, is to actually recognize that there are places where we have failed and we can do better, and that the great legislation that we've passed, we now have to do everything we possibly can to make sure that it's helping people have better lives as a result of it. and that we haven't completely arrived there, and that we can be vulnerable enough to listen and recognize that we don't always get it right.
Representative Ramirez, thank you for being on Let's Just Talk, and we look forward to continuing these conversations with you all.
Thank you, Hameen. Thank you for those important questions.